I am indeed. Thank you very much, Sarah.
I'm gonna.
Welcome, everybody. Was there something else you needed to add, Sarah?
I was gonna unmute Pat. I was just warning her.
Okay. Fair enough. Well, while you're unmuting Pat, I just want to tell everybody how pleased we are that you can all be with us this afternoon, and how delighted we are to have Pat with us. Pat, as many of you know, is the guru of gurus on neuroscience and how it applies to education and teaching and practice and learning in the classroom. She has trained thousands of administrators, boards of education, parents, teachers all over the United States and, in fact, all over the world. Her book on Brain Matters, which gives us an excuse to talk to her today because the second edition came out last year, has been read by I don't know how many, but lots and lots and lots of teachers. And the best part for me is that every time I talk to Pat, I learn something new. So, Pat, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Great. So the first thing I wanted to ask you, which I don't think I've ever really asked you, is how you first got interested in neuroscience, and what is it about it that really got you, fired up your obvious passion for sharing that with others?
I was a classroom teacher and felt that I was not adequately prepared for what I did in the classroom. I found that my teacher education was pretty useless. I had lots of classroom management problems. I almost quit twice, kept changing grade levels. And then I had the good fortune to be trained by a Dr. Madeline Hunter from UCLA. Madeline was a psychologist, and she had a program called The Elements of Effective Instruction. And this was my first introduction to, there's a science to teaching as well as an art. We didn't know anything about the brain at that point, but many years later I became a trainer for Dr. Hunter and went to a conference and heard someone say something about short-term memory. And, that's what turned me on. I thought, we're teaching brains and we don't know how they work. Maybe, just maybe, if we learned how kids learn, it would help us do a better job of helping them succeed. And that started me on the journey. I have to admit, at that time, there wasn't much out there that I could read and understand. Most of it was written by neuroscientists for neuroscientists. But over the years, our knowledge has accelerated tremendously. We probably learned more about the brain in the last year than in the past 100 years. And it's a fascinating topic.
It is a fascinating topic. So as you talk to teachers, many of whom I imagine have had a similar experience, I wish I could make that call go away, as you had in the classroom, I know my experience is very much like that, is that, your energy and your dedication only gets you so far, and then you run up against some things that you don't know how to deal with. So when you're talking to teachers, what kind of information do you find that they find the most surprising, and what kind of information do you think has the biggest impact on how teachers teach when they understand some of these brain principles?
I think probably the one thing that people are the most fascinated with is the whole idea of plasticity. The brain you're born with is not the brain you're stuck with. And I think I was given that message. Okay, you have kids. They come from low socioeconomic background. They haven't had preschool. Their IQs are minimal. And there's not much you can do the best you can. And I followed that advice. I remember trying to teach reading in first and second grade. And some of my kids succeeded, but I'm not sure that I had much to do with their success. I think they learned in spite of me. Then I had about 30% of my kids I couldn't teach to read. And I thought, well, they've just got something wrong with their brain. There's nothing we can do. Well, we know so much better than that now. We realize that your genes are a really important part of who you are, but they're not the whole story. The environment plays a tremendous role. And as I tell teachers, you're not just teaching. You are literally, physiologically shaping brains. So I think the whole idea of if we can find the right methods and the right strategies, we can change even brains that have glitches, like in dyslexia. And there are many studies going on that show that we can, in many cases, overcome some of the problems. I think the other major finding is that there are two different types of memory. One we call procedural, where it's a how to do something. It's something you've done over and over and over to the point it becomes automatic and unconscious, like driving a car, like our decoding skills in reading, like writing, playing the piano. And the types of practice activities you use for those are different than the activities you use for what we call declarative memory. That's what you know, your concepts, your facts, what we teach in school. And that the types of rehearsal or practice strategies we use need to match the type of memory we're teaching. I think that's probably one of the things that has had the biggest impact. For example, the flashcards are not the best way to teach the multiplication table. Memorizing vocabulary definitions is not the best way to increase your vocabulary. And so looking at matching what we do in the classroom to the type of memory has been a real eye-opener for me, and I think for a lot of teachers.
Yeah, I think that those, those two things. First of all, understanding that brains can change and are changing no matter what we do, so we can actually impact that. And then learning in different ways, not just because people learn in different ways, but because we all learn in different ways depending on the nature of what we're trying to learn.
Right.
Yeah. Wonderful. When we talk about learning and thinking and the kinds of things that the expectation of teachers seem to go up year by year. And I was listening, and critical thinking is one of those, thinking skills in general, and critical thinking has become something people are talking a lot about. In a recent conference, I heard a prominent researcher say that we are not born thinking like scientists, and that we have to learn the discipline of science. But in your book, you describe basically what a lot of people refer to as the scientist in the cradle, which is that we go about exploring our world and really learn from it, and everything that we do and the way that we think and the way our brains function is really a result of that exploration. So could you comment on that and how those conflict, or maybe there's a way to reconcile those two ideas?
Well, I'm not sure what he or she was talking about. I think if you're looking at the scientific method, yes, you do have to teach and practice the scientific method. But the comment in my book came from a book called The Scientist in the Crib. And it's talking about, from the moment babies are born, their environment begins to shape their world. We have something in our brains called mirror neurons, like you're looking in a mirror. And these neurons fire when you watch someone else do something. And one of the major implications of discovery of these mirror neurons is that it's probably how children learn language. You can look at a very, very young child, only a month old, and as long as they can focus their eyes and look at you, when you talk to them, they're watching your mouth. They're watching how you make the sound. They are becoming little scientists. How do you move your tongue? Now, they're not talking, obviously, but the neurons, the brain cells in their brain are firing and practicing how to make those sounds long before they can talk. So another example, which is a social one, Dr. Bruce Perry, who is so famous in looking at the impact of the early environment on the brain. It says when a baby cries, very, very young, and you pick that baby up and you hold the baby, you have begun to establish in that child's brain, in the emotional part of that child's brain, the feeling of trust. When I hurt, when I'm hungry, when I cry, there's going to be someone there who's going to take care of me. You are literally forming the connection in the brain for this social skill, the skill of trusting other people. So I think that probably if this presenter was talking about scientific methods, that's one thing it does have to be taught. But babies are not a blank slate on which we write. They are forming opinions, they're forming hypotheses, and they're testing them. And anyone who's ever had a child has watched them test. If I cry, what will happen? You know, if I touch this, what will happen? So I think that the authors of this book are very, very accurate in saying that babies are scientists in the crib from the very beginning.
Wonderful. Okay. Another question that sort of has come up around critical thinking, and this question, I hope this person is, it's one of the people who registered to attend the webinar today, and I hope they're on because I loved reading it. It said, help! Critical thinking seems to have gotten lost with this multitasking generation. Do you have any tips for teachers?
Yeah.
And I couldn't.
Well, I agree. You know, this is the whole area of what is the impact of technology on the brain. And I'll say from the beginning, it's not a black and white picture. There is some technology that is wonderful in helping to shape the brain, overcoming disabilities. But if you look at the general use of technology, there is a lot of research that says it's damaging brains. For example, if you, this is a study where they took kids who were given access to the internet during class and were encouraged to use it during lectures. It showed they didn't process what the speaker said as well as students who did not have internet access. So when the students were tested, those who did not have internet access performed better than those who did. Well, why is that? Probably because if you have internet access, you have your keyboard in front of you, you're working really hard to get down all of the words the person said, and there's very little processing going on. The same thing is true with reading and visual media. You know, parents should read to kids, and kids should read. When you're reading a book, you can read it on a Kindle if you want to. You can stop and think, and you form visual images in your mind. I'm sure all of you do this. In fact, I hate to go to a movie after I've read the book because the pictures aren't right. They're not the ones that I formed in my head. But if you have all of that showing for you on the screen, you are robbing the brain of developing its own visual images, its own imagery, and that cuts back the ability of the brain to do that. So I think that our skills in critical analysis and critical thinking have declined, while our visual skills have improved. And this research comes, if you want to check this out, this is Patricia Greenfield at UCLA. She's a distinguished professor of psychology and director of the Children's Digital Media Center. Do I have tips? Yeah, you know, take a look at the technology you're using and say, why am I using this? Is this, have I selected this technology for a particular purpose? Or is it just the latest thing out there? I read the other day that there are schools where every kindergartner now has an iPad. That's good or bad. Depends on how it is used. There's a lot of negative impact, say, of violent video games, which appear through brain imaging techniques that teenagers who play a lot of violent games, and incidentally, about 85% of video games contain violence. They are actually becoming desensitized to real-life violence. On the other hand, I think what you need to do is balance. Students aren't going to do critical thinking if we don't ask them to do it. And I'll go back to that horrible old Bloom's taxonomy, where most of the questions on standardized tests and that we ask in classrooms are very low-level questions, just knowledge and comprehension. We don't ask kids, what would have happened if this character had not done such and such? Or can you think of any other way to solve this math problem besides the one the book shows? So if we don't ask students to do critical thinking, if we don't mesh it into our classroom instruction, it won't happen. I don't know, that may be kind of a flip answer, and I hope it's helpful. But it is true that critical thinking skills have declined, and I think it's because we're not asking or giving students the opportunity to do critical thinking.
Yeah. So I think that your two pieces of advice there, if I could just restate them and maybe just make sure that we're all clear on that, is first of all that technology in and of itself has to be used very purposefully, and that it's not, you don't just let it happen. It's always in service of some learning goal. And the second thing is that you have to be really conscious of engaging students in the critical thinking process and asking the kinds of questions and setting the kinds of challenges that force them to not just spit things back.
Right, and there's a lot of good programs out there. Edward de Bono's Thinking Hats, I watched a kindergarten teacher just last week ask the kids to put on their thinking caps, and all these little 5-year-olds put on their caps. Just because I'm going to ask you a hard question, and I don't know what the answer is. I'll be anxious to see what you do, what you think. That kind of thing from a very early age, long before children can read, when we're still reading to them, you can begin to work on higher level thinking by asking them questions. I saw a homework paper the other day where this is first grade, where the children are supposed to read a story, and then they're supposed to write a sentence. And they're given some sentence starters. I predict, or I was surprised, or I would change. When you give students this opportunity, this young, to begin thinking in divergent ways, and for the teachers to say, I don't know. What do you think? Yeah. So, yes, Betsy, I think you're right.
Great. Well, I want to come back and address technology, a specific kind of technology, a little bit later. But there's another question that I think some of this gets at, too, that came also from one of our participants today. And that is somebody who really wanted to understand more about what we know from neuroscience research about social and emotional development, and whether the research suggests that we should be focusing on that in schools, and whether there is evidence of a relationship between academic performance and intellectual development connected with social and emotional development.
Okay, you bet there is. And I think every teacher who's tuned in will tell you that the major emphasis today is academic performance. And I think that's wrong. Now, obviously, literacy is important. Numeracy is important. You will have a very difficult job in school if you can't read. So I understand why they're testing, reading scores and math scores. But high intelligence, doing well on these kinds of things, does not predict how well you do in the world. Let's look at emotional intelligence, for example. I think there are a lot of people with very high IQs who do very, very well academically, who have poor emotional skills. I'm sure most of you know them. I often use the example of, I'm sure Osama bin Laden had a high IQ, and so did Hitler. But I think they were lacking in compassion and emotional development. In fact, in his book, Daniel Goleman, this book came out several years, called Emotional Intelligence, he pointed out that people with high emotional intelligence, the ability to work well with other people, the ability to read other people's faces and empathize with them, had more to do with your success in life than your academic performance did. In fact, he pointed out in this book that if you look at the kids who were valedictorians, salutatorians in their classes versus those who didn't do quite as well but had well-developed emotional intelligence, there was a huge difference in how successful people were in life. Those with higher emotional intelligence did better in life. There's another. I want to give you for the person who asked that question, I want to give you a resource. And the group is called CASEL, C-A-S-E-L, and CASEL stands for the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. More often, we call this SEL, Social Emotional Learning. And what they have discovered in a very, very large study, in fact, it's a meta-analysis where they looked at the findings of the largest and most scientifically rigorous review of research, and they looked at school-based intervention programs that worked at developing students' social emotional intelligence. And they found out that the students who received this school-based social emotional learning program scored 11 percentile points higher on academic achievement tests. So the kids got higher grades. At the same time, they improved their classroom behavior. They improved their feelings about themselves. They handled emotional problems better. And they had better social and emotional skills. I think we need to look at developing the whole child. Social development with no ability to perform academically is a problem. Intellectual growth. What comes to mind with intellectual growth are students who have Asperger's syndrome, which is sometimes considered high-performing autism. Many of these people are brilliant, very, very, very high IQs, and do not know how to read other people's faces, do not know how to get along with other people. And what's really going to be important, if you own a big company and you're going to hire someone, are you going to hire someone who made straight A's only? And are you going to hire someone who knows how to work in a group and listen to other people, who has a well-developed emotional and social brain as well as an intellectual brain? And I could get on a soapbox about this, but I really feel it is so important that we try to develop the whole child and lessen our dependence on academics.
Well, I know as someone who has hired her share of people that you're going to get no disagreement on that from me, and I think people feel so much more accomplished. I mean, I think that you can be very
happy. They're happier people.
Yeah,
they're happier people. They live longer too, incidentally, and they have less Alzheimer's. There's a study on that one. People who know how to get along with other people and have good social contacts have less Alzheimer's than people who don't.
Well, that's definitely
if nothing else,
that's got my attention. Getting to that age. Another thing that I really like to think about as we're talking about brains and what we understand about them is to remember that teachers also have brains. So there's some things that happen within the learning experience in the classrooms, but teachers have brains too, and as we know from what you've talked about with plasticity, that teachers continue to develop their brains and to learn. So what thoughts do you have for principals and other administrators who support teachers' ongoing development, and what are some of the implications for either professional development or assessment. There's been a whole lot of talk recently in Congress and around the states and the state legislatures about assessment of teacher performance and that kind of thing.
This is another soapbox for me. You know, what has happened with the economy and the cutback on funds is that we have seen a tremendous drop in funds for teacher staff development, which makes absolutely no sense. Approximately 90% of a district's monies are paying teachers, and yet we're not training teachers well, and we're not helping them with continuing professional development. I was asked by a superintendent recently if I could change one thing about education, what would it be? And I said it would be to give teachers some really good scientific information about how kids learn, and then give them time to engage in substantive dialogue about what that means in their classroom, to perhaps plan lessons together and then go out and teach one and then come back and say, how did it work? What other strategies might I use? There's a tremendous amount of expertise in every teacher's head that never gets shared. Our schools are not designed for teachers to talk to one another. It's a very lonely profession. You're locked in a room with, 25 or 30 immature brains and no opportunity to discuss your craft. One of the researchers at Harvard, Kurt Fisher, has suggested that as doctors have teaching hospitals, where the doctors can talk to the people who are doing the research, and where doctors go on rounds together, and where they get together and observe and discuss a patient and what to do, that this would be a wonderful model for schools, to have schools hooked to school districts, hooked to universities, where people are doing research on learning, where teachers could engage in action research. For example, I wonder if this method for teaching kids handwriting is better than another method, or should we even be teaching handwriting at all? Let's set up a study. Or what's the best method to help kids learn to spell? Or how do I teach the concept of noble gases, or photosynthesis, or meiosis and mitosis, very difficult concepts for kids? I think if we gave teachers the opportunity to talk to the researchers, read the research, and then try it out in their classrooms and come back together and discuss their findings, that would be treating teachers as real professionals. Instead of saying, okay, you finished your teacher prep, here you are, you've got 30 kids, some of them with autism, some of them with ADD. I'm sorry, there's no money for classroom aid. Do the best you can. That's not fair, and no wonder we are losing teachers.
I want to follow up a little bit because it really sparked a thought there, where we would all doctors go through a phase of their training that is in a teaching hospital. That's part of part of the hands-on, and as you like to say, minds-on activity that we require doctors to go through. And I can't imagine anybody would ever want to go to a doctor that had only learned a little bit of theory and maybe how to fill
out of a book. Yeah.
So are there ways that you think that teachers and others who really want to engage in some of this research, even if it's not at the level of a major teaching institution and a medical hospital, is there a way that they can contribute to research in the educational world?
They can, Betsy, but because of the way schools are designed, it would be extremely difficult. For example, in some Asian countries, teachers teach a half day, and then they bring in specialists for music and art and other kinds of things in the afternoon. And that is time for teachers to sit down and plan research. They actually are writing many of the papers that you find in educational research journals. I think it's very difficult for teachers in the United States. I mean, they are so dedicated, but they're so overloaded that to find the time to engage in what we call action research, that's research that takes place in a classroom with a teacher, is very, very difficult to do.
Mm-hmm.
I would really like to see it, but until the structure of the school, now some schools are doing learning communities, and there is certainly a research element in that, but here again, not that many schools are engaging in that type of activity. I don't mean this to be negative, but I want to be realistic.
Yeah, well, it's a sort of one of those, policy kinds of things that seems like it could have an enormous impact on the quality of our education that we're not taking advantage.
We're not doing.
Yeah.
And maybe we as teachers need to just stand up and say, we're not taking this anymore. I don't know. I'm not proposing anarchy, but I don't have the answer.
What happens, I think, is that the loneliness and the sense of isolation. I know this was true for me. It's one of the reasons that I left teaching when I did a million years ago was the fact that there really was no sense of community, and it's not very motivating, and it's not very rewarding.
Well, I remember being so discouraged when I didn't know how to help kids, no matter what I did. I didn't know what their problems were, why they couldn't read. I didn't know why they had the behavior problems they did, and I didn't have the skills to manage it. And you see, I selected this profession because I really care about, helping to educate young minds. But if I don't know how to do it and I don't have the resources or the help, it's very discouraging.
Yeah. I want to talk about a couple of specific areas of brain knowledge, or sometimes myth, that we have heard a lot about in recent years. One is this whole concept of left brain and right brain functions and how that applies to learning. I think there are some misconceptions out there, and so I think it's a useful topic.
Yes, it is. This idea of people being left-brained or right-brained came from some early studies in the 80s with patients who had epilepsy, and the seizures were passing from one hemisphere to the other hemisphere, and they discovered there's a big band of fibers that connect your two hemispheres, and if they cut it, then the seizure stopped. Well, these are called split brain patients, and it was very successful, but when they did that, and these two hemispheres could not communicate with one another, they discovered that your hemispheres are specialized. Now, first of all, there is no such thing as a right brain or a left brain. You have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And they talk to each other all the time through this big band of fibers. What comes into one hemisphere immediately goes to the other, and vice versa. I think, so generally speaking, your left hemisphere in about 95% of the people contains language. And if you have a stroke in the language area of your left hemisphere, you will lose speech. That's well known. However, it's not quite that clear cut because you also have a language area in the right hemisphere. And if you should have a stroke there, you could still speak, but you would speak in a monotone. You would not be able to put any emotional emphasis in your speech. People believe that the right hemisphere is the hemisphere where you process music. Well, it depends. If you are composing music, it's more of a left hemispheric job. If you're just listening to it, you'll activate more brain cells in the right hemisphere. So it's not clear cut. Now, the main problem, though, is calling someone right-brained or left-brained. So because the left hemisphere is more analytical and the right hemisphere is more global, we call people who are well-organized and good at reading and writing, we call them left-brained. Well, in actuality, it's not a preference. or a hemisphere that makes the person that way. It's an inborn genetic learning style. We are born with different propensities. Some of us are born more organized than others, and so we call them left brain. But it doesn't mean that their left hemisphere is more efficient. So when people start talking about left brain and right brain people, you know they don't know much about the brain. And I you know, there's a lot more in the book on that. But basically, the two hemispheres operate together all the time, thank goodness, and that they do different things. And that's really an efficient use of brain space.
So does that imply, what does that imply for teaching and learning? Does that mean we should, obviously we need to recognize that our students are using both hemispheres of their brains all the time, and that they, do we consciously have to teach to both sides, or?
I think basically our schools are set up to use the left hemisphere. You know, if you look at what the left hemisphere is very good at, reading and writing and analyzing, that's mostly what we do. However, the right hemisphere can learn through music, can learn through dance, it can learn through experimentation, all of which are more right hemispheric activities. So I think basically we should try to offer options in the classroom that take advantage of both hemispheres of the brain. Here again, developing the whole child. And of course, music and art, and a lot of those things that are really fun and through which many kids learn have been diminished as the funding has diminished. That's really too bad.
And it sounds like from your earlier discussion that would suggest that they are not learning as well or as thoroughly, or so that it actually would impact the what we consider to be the academics, you know, the test scores.
Right. Exactly.
All right. I'd like to talk about one more brain part or area of the brain that has gotten a lot of attention lately, and in the book you talk about the fact that our frontal lobes, the prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of our brain, which is the area that makes decisions and controls impulses, is still developing, at least now we think, into our mid-20s. So anybody who teaches just about anybody through undergraduate is dealing with a less than developed prefrontal cortex. So what does that mean for and I know we've been talking about this last weekend when we were listening to Adriana Galvan, who was fascinating. But what does that mean, and can you share a little bit of that, the behavior of adolescents and the implications for educators?
Surely. The brain grows very, very rapidly in the first few years. In fact, the human brain reaches almost its adult size by about age 6. So if you look at your kids in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, realize that their brains are probably between 90 and 95% of the size and weight of your own brain. And unfortunately, many years ago, we thought, well, our adolescents, starting around 11 or 12, now have a full-size adult brain, therefore they should act like adults. And anyone who's ever had a teenager or taught one knows that's not true. So what the neuroscience has been able to discover is that your brain kind of develops from the back to the front, if you will. And the back of the brain, the cerebellum that handles motor coordination and balance, develops pretty rapidly. That's why children can walk around a year old and begin to be able to pick up things. The auditory part of the brain on the side and the visual on the back develop very, very early. But the part of the brain that is the last to develop is what we call the prefrontal cortex, the PFC. And this is right behind your eyes. It's the part of the brain that allows you to do higher-level rational thinking, as you mentioned, to resist impulsive behavior, to prioritize, to make good decisions, unfortunately, this part of the brain is not fully developed until perhaps in your mid-20s, maybe even later. However, the emotional part of the brain, a couple of structures called the amygdala, are fully developed. And the amygdala is the part of the brain that allows you to feel emotions. So what we have in adolescence is a brain that takes risks. And this happens to be true of all mammals in their adolescence. They know the dangers of driving too fast, but they still do it because the chemical reaction they get, a chemical called dopamine, which makes you feel really good, is in high gear in the adolescent brain. But the part of the brain that says it's probably not a good idea isn't fully developed. Jay Geed, who's probably one of the primary researchers in this area, says these adolescents are like trucks without brakes. Now, fortunately, for most kids, they eventually outgrow and the prefrontal cortex becomes more fully developed and they make better decisions. But teaching adolescents is a little tricky. Here again, however, if we don't give them any background or understanding of their brain and its development, this goes back to plasticity. These kids, when they understand that they are going through a tremendous formation of this prefrontal cortex, can have some control over the kind of person they become. If you spend all of your time playing video games, that's what you'll become good at. And realizing that they have some control over how their own brain develops. I think we should teach every single adolescent. In fact, I'm doing this with middle school right now. I'm doing these sessions with the kids. I'm explaining to them how their brain works. I'm explaining to them how sometimes dopamine makes them do really dumb things and that they need to learn how to control some of those impulses by stopping and thinking about, okay, if I do this, what will the results be? If I play video games until 2 a.m. in the morning, what's that going to do to my brain the next morning? So I think one of the most important things we can do is teach kids about their own brains. Now, on the other hand, adolescence is an exuberant, wonderful time, but they're not very good at sitting still at desk taking notes. We need to design our instruction to take advantage of this high emotional by having debate, by engaging them in role plays and simulations and the kinds of things that they're very, very good at. It's tricky, but for anyone teaching sixth grade all the way through college, you need, as a teacher, to become aware of the changes that are taking place in that adolescent brain and what you can do about it to some degree and what kinds of strategies are best suited for this developing brain.
Which really connects to some of the discussion you have in your book about the kinds of strategies to enhance the learning process, the projects and real-life problems and songs and visual activities and just sort of the get up and get these.
Yes, these are good for all kids.
Yeah, and when you talk about real-life problems, one of our participants today asked about how important are real-world connections for learning, and I have my opinions, but I love the way you talk about this, so I ask you to talk about it.
Yeah. Let's take my favorite whipping boy, which is multiplication of fractions, okay? We teach it in 5th grade, and most kids learn how to multiply fractions. But I will guarantee you that the majority of them have no idea what they're doing. They have learned a formula. Now, when do you ever use multiplication fractions? If you're going to teach something to kids, I think it's extremely important that we teach them how it is used in the real world. One of my favorite quotes is from Elliot Eisner, who says, our job is not to help kids do well in school, it's to help them do well in life. In other words, when we're teaching something to students, I need to teach them how it is used in the real world. Otherwise, you get out in the real world, and I'm a prime example of this. I don't know how to use what I learned in school. And I made very good grades in algebra and geometry, and I can't figure out those problems that require those skills. So what we need to do, I think, is not only teach kids how to do things, but we need to give them problems to solve that use the information. Our main goal is transfer what we're teaching in school to the real world. Howard Gardner says that the majority of our best students with the highest SAT scores cannot use what they learned in school outside of school when they're faced with a new, unanticipated situation. Well, if that is true, so I'll ask you, those of you who are listening, how many of you took a chemistry class? What do you remember from that chemistry class you took in high school or college? I will guarantee that unless you're teaching chemistry, you remember very, very little of it. Maybe the periodic table on the wall, and maybe the experiment in the lab that went wrong, as with me. I remember that. Of what practical use is that? We don't give kids problems to solve that people have to solve in the real world. And if we don't do that, the chances of them using what they learned in school outside of school decreases dramatically. And it's not that hard to do. It's not that hard to do. We can't just teach the formulas. We've got to teach how they're used.
Wonderful. I'd like to now go back and talk. I want to come back to technology a little bit, because one of the things that you added to your book in this new edition is some discussion of programs, some technology programs, not the ones that we're seeing on the screen here, which are examples of stuff that is all over the place and probably involved in some of that lack of deep thinking that students are experiencing. But you talk about programs that develop cognitive processing skills. You mentioned a couple of them. And what would you tell educators who are looking at programs like Fast Forward or Brainware Safari or these programs that are specifically designed to develop skills like attention or auditory processing or other?
Sure. When we talk about, did I lose you?
No, I'm here.
Oh, okay. My phone just said, call. It's okay. I became really, really interested in, initially, Fast Forward. It was one of the first programs where a couple of scientists discussed kids who have difficulty reading have an auditory processing delay. In other words, got a glitch in the system. Their brains did not process the sounds fast enough to allow them to blend the words. Like, you can't blend two sounds together. You're going to have a heck of a time learning to read. So they developed a program called Fast Forward with some exercises and proved that it literally, when the kids played these computer games, it actually speeded up the auditory processing in the brains, allowing kids to blend sounds together and eventually improve their reading. So that was one of the first ones. However, that program, as good as it is for auditory processing, has not had as much success in other areas. The program that I'm the most impressed with that deals also with auditory processing, but with 40 other cognitive skills, is a program called Brainware Safari. And I like, because so many of the computer programs that are out there are designed to help kids who are having a reading problem or a math problem. And here's ways to increase your reading skill or your math skill. The problem with that, with those kinds of activities, is that they do not take into account that sometimes the reasons why you can't read or you can't do math or you're having problems with handwriting is that you lack a cognitive skill to be able to do that. Excuse me. And when I talk about cognitive skills, I'm talking about things like visual processing speed or auditory processing speed, or maybe the child has a difficulty with a slow processing of short-term memory, or difficulty getting things from short-term memory into long-term memory. I mean, there's all kinds of different cognitive skills that underlie your ability to read, to do math, to comprehend what you read, etc. So if I had a child, say, 20 years ago, who had a visual processing problem, all right, I would have to take the child to a specialist who would work one-on-one with the child, and many times they were successful. But, first of all, most of us don't know how to identify visual processing. Number two, that's very expensive. And number three, they work with kids one-on-one, sometimes for months. What Brainware Safari has done is taken the skills that many of these private therapists were using and put them into a very engaging set of video game exercises that are showing a lot of promise in improving cognitive skills. And that's why I like it, because it's very broad-based. It's looking at not just one skill, but many, many skills. And having an impact then, once you develop a better visual processing or better short-term memory, that's going to show up in your schoolwork. It's going to be more successful. As a whole, technology it's not a panacea. There's some technology. I mean, don't take my cell phone away from me, please. Or don't take away my iPad, and don't take away my Mac or my PC. You know, I depend on them for my business, but I think I know how to use them. All right. Unfortunately, we sometimes get carried away with technology in classrooms, and if there's money, every classroom has a smart board, every kid has an iPad. I'm thinking back. This was a study that was done in Chicago quite a few years ago. They took two carefully matched groups of kids. They were fifth grade. And one group worked just with the teacher, solved problems, paper and pencil, pretty much the typical way. The other group spent a lot of time solving problems on computers. And so it was a pretty good-sized study, pretty rigorous, well-designed. Then they looked at the kids' scores, and they found out something very interesting. The kids who used the computers in the classroom during the math lessons scored lower than the others. Now, if you go back and just aggregate the data, what they discovered was that the kids whose scores were lower, the teachers were using the computers as electronic demo sheets. Just instead of doing it on paper and pencil, you were doing it on the computer. But there were a few teachers who were using the computers for the kids to take what they'd learned and solve problems with it. In that case, their scores went way up. So it was not the technology per se, but the way the teacher was using the technology in the classroom that made the difference. And I think this holds true across the board. You know, you can't say it's bad or it's good. It certainly isn't a panacea. It's, do you know what it is you want to do, what kind of thinking you want, and does this program help you accomplish that, this technology? If not, don't use it. All right? So it's really understanding your objectives, concepts you want to get across, and then being able to determine whether or not the technology will help you reach that goal better than some other methods. That's in a nutshell.
It sounds like a challenge for teachers to really think through those issues.
And too often we're given technology without any training. So you don't know how to use it.
Well, and you often hear about teachers who are given technology without that training, and then, the sort of criticism of some more experienced teachers, shall we say, is that, well, they don't like the technology or they just won't use it. But part of it is really understanding why and how and where to use it.
Well, yeah, and I'll tell you what, you give me a new computer program with absolutely no training, I will not be successful and I'll drop it. So something that could potentially be excellent if I have not been given, sufficient training in how to use it correctly, I won't use it correctly.
Right. Well, I'd like to finish up by talking a little bit about how you see the world in terms of some of the barriers to getting educators to a much more broad-based understanding of the brain and its applications in the classroom. And one of our participants asked whether you see any hopeful signs and
just looking at this picture.
I know what I want. We all know what we want to hear, but what is your assessment? And what do you think? If you're a teacher, or if you're an administrator, if you're a policymaker, we have probably a variety of people on the phone today. What would you suggest?
One of the problems is that we, in the field of education, have had a tendency to jump on bandwagons. And I've been teaching since the ice was melting, so I've watched a lot of them, teaching machines, time on task, a lot of different programs. And we jump on the bandwagon and we say it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, and then pretty soon you find it either not being used well or not understood, and then it gets dropped, and then something new comes down the pike. And as a classroom teacher, you used to say, well, just sit tight, this too will pass. I have worried, since I am so excited about the potential of the brain, understanding the brain for teaching and learning, that this would happen. I don't think it will. Here's one of the problems. As a whole, we as educators are not good consumers of research. We take what is written in Time or Newsweek or in the local newspaper, and we take it as gospel. We don't read the actual research. When what we end up with are what I like to call neuromyths or pseudoscience. And you're familiar with it. We only use 10% of our brain. Not true. Listening to Mozart will make you smarter. Not true. You're left-brained or you're right-brained. Not true. Drinking lots of water will raise reading scores. It won't. But we have a lot of people who believe those in the general public because someone misinterpreted some research and wrote an article about it in the paper. So one of the big problems that people like me face is trying to educate people. We don't have all the answers. We know a lot more about the brain than we knew before. We know about its neuroplasticity, the fact that it can change. We now have some ideas about what to do with dyslexia because of some wonderful brain imaging scans that are being done with dyslexic kids. But we have too many erroneous beliefs out there. And unfortunately, when something like this becomes kind of a hot topic, you have a lot of people jumping on bandwagons, doing workshops and offering curriculum materials that are not scientifically based. I was at a conference not long ago, and I went into the booksellers section, and there's this big sign and it said, check here for brain-compatible worksheets or brain-based worksheets. Well, first of all, that's an oxymoron. Worksheets are not brain-based. Can't be, and I don't like the term brain-based anyway, because all learning is brain-based. I like the term brain-compatible, if you will. So on the one hand, we have that problem, but on the other hand, we now have many universities who are offering masters and doctorates in the brain in education. Harvard, University of Connecticut, Washington University. We have a journal out now called Mind, Brain, and Education. Very scientific, actually. It's a little tricky to read sometimes. But I'm seeing more and more of an interest. So I guess what I would say to teachers is start reading, you know, and check who's doing the writing, check their credentials. And when you hear that a study shows or brain research shows, don't believe it unless the person tells you how many people were in the study. Was there a control group? You know, are you reading rigorous research, or is somebody just jumping on the brain-based bandwagon? And that's tricky. That's tricky. But I think it has great potential if we're careful.
Sounds like one of those things that they might engage in conversation with their colleagues about in the time that they don't have to talk about what works and what doesn't work.
Well, and you know, I'm not promoting my book, but I will tell you that book took me originally 2 full years to write, because every time I put something down, I'd have to say, okay, is this really true? I better go check with a neuroscientist to find out that I'm saying it accurately. All right. So it's a tricky topic, but I think it's a powerful one. I think it has the power to make us true professionals. You know, would you want to go to a doctor who's never had a course in how the body works? No. Well, we shouldn't have anyone going to teachers who don't understand the teaching and learning process, and that takes place in the brain.
We have one question that I just want to ask you because I think it will help clarify something that maybe wasn't clear earlier. Somebody asked if you would review what declarative memory is and what is learned with declarative memory, and whether flashcards have any role in rote tasks, sort of the whole...
Thank you. I really did gloss over that. It's a pretty complex subject. Let's say declarative memory, which is stored in a different part of your brain than procedural. So remember, procedural is a habit or a skill that you have done over and over and over until it's automatic and unconscious. That's why you can drive your car to school and then all of a sudden realize you're not aware of having driven there. Okay. You can read a page in a book, get to the bottom of the page and realize you have no idea what you just read because you were thinking of something else. Okay, that's procedural memory. Your brain read every word on the page. Declarative memory, on the other hand, is semantic information. Who was Martin Luther King? When did he live? When did you learn to read? Not that you can read, but when you learn to read would be declarative. Understanding the concept of photosynthesis is declarative. Now, why did I say that flashcards aren't that good? I think in some cases, flashcards may have some limited application. But if you want kids to get the multiplication tables into procedural memory where they're automatic, think about which ones we learn first. We learn the 2s, 5s, and 10s. And I think we learn them first because we learn to count by 2s, 5s, and 10s. There's a rhythm. And you said that over 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, or 5, 10, 15, 20, to the place where it became automatic. We could do that with the rest of them. And I think that would be much faster and a much better way. Put them to rhythm, put them to counting, put them to songs, all the others, and kids would get them a lot faster. So that's why I'm saying, and vocabulary. Let me just give you an example. 7th grade teacher I watched was giving her kids, 15 vocabulary words for the week. And the kids, each pair, everybody gets a partner, gets one word, and they draw a vocabulary poster to depict the meaning of the word, and they present it to the class on Friday, and then they have a test to the words on Monday. And on these posters, the dictionary definition may not appear. Their drawing has to explain to the rest of the class what the word means. The teacher who did her master's thesis on this found that their understanding and retention and use of vocabulary words increased 400% versus, writing down the dictionary definition and trying to memorize it. So looking for ways that are more brain compatible. So the rote rehearsal, doing something over and over and over, is essential for procedural memory. You learn to drive a car by driving it over and over and over. You learn to read by reading over and over and over. But you don't learn the process of photosynthesis of vocabulary definitions by repeating them over and over and over. You need to elaborate on them, give them meaning. So that's what I mean by the difference. I hope that helps a little.
That was great. That was wonderful. So we've overrun our time a little bit, so I think we need to close up. And I want to thank you, Pat, so much for sharing your time with us today. Those of you who have not read, if there's anybody on this call who has not read Brain Matters, it is a wonderful, wonderful book that goes through things like declarative memory and procedural memory and lots more. It's really a wonderful text for people at any level of knowledge, actually, to understand how the brain is, the things that they need to really understand about the brain for teaching and learning. So, Pat, thank you again, and we'll look forward to talking to you again.
It was my pleasure, and good luck to all of you who have entered this noble profession.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.